Hello, my name is Eddie Otchere. I'm a photographer and my special interests are music, hip-hop, electronic music particularly, and how we as people interact with it. Thank you.
Hi everybody, welcome to Unexpected Views. We're going to be filming this discussion today, so that's why we've got all of this set up. And there'll be opportunity at the end for Q&A, so please hold your questions for then. So the premise of Unexpected Views is to have a conversation between a curator from the National Gallery and a contemporary artist and cultural practitioner to focus on a selected work in the collection and to discuss their work, your work, and to think about broader cultural, societal questions and issues. I'd like to say thank you to Hiscox, who are our contemporary art partner, for making this possible. My name's Emily Stone, and I'm the project curator here for the Jeremy Deller Commission and the Modern and Contemporary team at the National Gallery. And I'm joined today by Eddie Otchere, who is a photographer, educator, and curator, best known for his photographs of seminal rappers and DJs of the mid-1990s to the early noughties. His celebrated works include portraits of Biggie Smalls, Blackstar, So Solid Crew, Est'elle, Goldie, Omar, Aaliyah, and many others, as well as his official coverage of the Metalheads Blue Note sessions 1994 to 96. Since 1993, Eddie's photographs have been exhibited and published worldwide, including on the covers of major international magazines such as Freeze, Dazed, Lowdown, Mix Mag, and on the covers of some of rap music's seminal albums. And most recently, you've published with Cafe Royal Books, Wu-Tang Clan 94 to 2004, and we've got a couple of copies to circulate for you to have a look through and see some of those works. So today we are stood in front of Hendrick ter Brugghen's 1626 painting, The Concert. Why are we here? Why this artwork?
It's about light for me. The fundamentals are really about light, and particularly my fascination with what happens after dark. When things get dark and when music comes out and when you crush the grapes and ferment them, yes, the magic of the night time. And obviously music, my thing has always been music, and to see that being reproduced as a painting is also a very beautiful thing. But more importantly, I think this particular room is about ter Brugghen and his contemporaries in the Utrecht school of art and how they were influenced by Caravaggio and that style of chiaroscuro, what we would call in photography high contrast. And that's really what drew me to this, working with artificial light, working with the subject of music, and those little hints, these allegorical components, like the grapes that sit in the corner that look like they're completely lit from a different angle than everyone else. But the grapes are symbolic, and certainly for most of the rappers I've ever worked with, they wouldn't be interested in grapes, but a bag of weed right there, that would say everything this painting's saying. Because this is the contemporary universe we're in.
So I think when we first looked at this, you were immediately drawn to these grapes and how strange they are, why are they here? And we looked into it, and ter Brugghen's known with his kind of cohort of painters who are in this room as part of the Dutch Caravaggisti. They were really influenced by Caravaggio. They went to Rome. He went to Rome in 1605. He was looking at Caravaggio's work. Caravaggio has a very similar work, which includes the grapes, which is, I think it's called the Concert of Youths. But the grapes are a reference with the wine to Bacchus, and so it's this kind of raucous, nighttime celebration.
And I'm all about that, and I feel like it's always been a part of human society and human culture, and it's the way it's told and the way it's depicted. Obviously, we're lucky now that we have the technology to go into a really dark space with a camera, with a flash, and just capture those images almost as fleeting moments, but this had to be staged, but the spirit's still the same. And the way things happen, and so particularly I was always drawn by the candlelight, the way the light hits it says it's dark, it says it's at night, but I get the feeling from this that it's also a rehearsal and not necessarily a reproduction of a performance per se. I don't necessarily feel they're real musicians either. You sort of sense that, don't you?
It's definitely an imagined scene, and I think you'll see other representations throughout the gallery of these three musicians. It's quite a known representation in painting, but how he's treated it is really different. And I think the light sources that you're drawn to are really interesting, because your eye as a photographer, you were like, there's three sources of light here, and I don't know if you want to point them out to everybody.
I think the first and most obvious is the source of light that's on the grapes. And again, it's told by the pointedness. And if you imagine if you had a flash, it feels like the flash is coming from here, but it takes you out of the plane. It's almost on a flat plane versus the depth of that plane. And then particularly because it's nighttime, you have to allude to it, so the way shadows work. But this comes, and then you sort of feel like that shadow's going that way, but the light's coming from that candle, and then there's another light source coming from here somewhere.
And that gives you that depth of field, doesn't it?
Exactly, and it is just that, it's the depth of field. And, as a photographer, we walk these galleries, not necessarily to look at the themes or the narrative or the stories, which I find really challenging. I find this place horrible in terms of its themes and narratives, but the lighting and the way we record light and the way we capture light, I think, is the thing that you have to come here for. And particularly Caravaggio's use of light. I can see how you'd go to Rome, see Caravaggio's style, and it's like so stark and so contrasty, and then rush back to Europe, rush back to Northern Europe and start to play with that. But what I feel the Dutch did, which was quite beautiful in a way, is they toned down that hard shadow, light and dark. I mean, that painting over there particularly is a great example of hard contrast. And essentially, I mean, many photographers will always refer to certain lighting techniques as a Rembrandt lighting. If I say to my DOP, I want Rembrandt lighting, he knows exactly what I mean by that. Even if I say I want Caravaggio, he'll know exactly what I mean by that.
What do you mean by Rembrandt lighting?
It's daylight with a window. Subject, let's say the window's here, and the light pulls in this way, and your subject's literally just by the window, and you're positioned here. The light falls so, you capture the image so. So it's always sort of coming in from the right almost. Sort of just pours in quite. And where Rembrandt lighting comes into its own is particularly at the National Portrait Gallery Photographic Portrait Prize. They always go for things that look like paintings, particularly Dutch paintings, with the Rembrandt lighting coming in from the side, nice and soft, midsummer's day. If you've got red hair, you're going to be in the competition top 10. So it's combined those two things, and there's something almost romantic in that lighting. And I think, whereas Caravaggio's lighting is way harder, it's almost like a stark spotlight that's just hitting the subject, and everything falls to shadow behind. The highlights are really strong. And this, to me, is like the perfect mix between really hard contrasty lighting versus enough detail in the shadow for it not to fall to black completely.
Well, when we talk about Caravaggio and their travels to Rome, you kind of forget that they couldn't experience this work any other way than going and physically seeing it in person in the places where it had been made, and then bringing that back. And I wondered if you could talk a bit more about your influences and what inspires you as a photographer. I
think in the last 10 to 15 years particularly, I've been influenced by the analog world, the traditional world of photography, and more by the materials that were invented in the 20th century to record human history, as it were. And with that, there's a particular type of film called transparency film, E6 film, slide film. But essentially, it's a film that you process, and when you have it processed, you just look at it through the light, and the image is complete. There is no room for interpretation the way you would if you shot digitally or on film or negative film. And for me, that high contrast has been something I've been chasing now, that sense. And so Caravaggio sort of fell in with my studies of how the black point in an image and how deep can that black go. Because business for me isn't just taking a picture, isn't just servicing the client, but the business is also putting the work on paper so it can sit on the wall for 600 years comfortably without fading. And for me, that type of work Yeah, digital archive print might do that, but how old is the oldest digital print? It's not 600 years. It hasn't proved
Not yet.
itself. Exactly. So we don't know how it's going to fade or if it isn't going to fade. But certainly the business of putting it on paper has become an obsession for me. It's almost more important than the image itself. Like, how do we record our stories? How do we make these things tangible and real? And as an example, I just thought I'd bring a box of prints, because it's not just for myself I work for. Like that, my business is obviously to. Let's put that down there. You know, I'm not asking for a lot. It's just a basic print. But these materials, this particular paper isn't made anymore, and hasn't been made for over 30 years. The chemical that I used to print it with to get that tone has been discontinued because it contains so much cadmium, it's simply carcinogenic. So these materials are gone. And I know for a fact with the materials that I've used that this can last on the wall for over 1,000 years without fading. That's my influence now, is how do we retain our memories and how do we put it here so it's tangible? And it's not just for myself as well. I do the same thing for Charlie Phillips and other photographers, where I will still go through their negatives and go into the dark room and print for other photographers.
Well, speaking of Charlie Phillips, I mean, this is a conversation that we had really early on in this room, is that ter Brugghen was the apprentice of the master Abraham Blomert, who is behind us, actually, is the painting that if you're in the room you can turn around and have a look at. So he was working in his studio and learning from him. That's a religious painting, and you know he did do religious paintings as well, but then he would put his own stamp on it. And Charlie Phillips is somebody that you've worked with a really, really long time, and I don't know if you wanted to talk a bit about that kind of that master-apprentice relationship in photography, because it's so well known, I think, in painting, in old master painting particularly, as a kind of standard way of working and learning your craft.
It's really important, I think, particularly seeking. I sought the advice of two who I would consider grandmasters of photography. James Barner, who is almost 100 years old now, who is the living link between African photography and Europeans.
So he was working in Ghana?
He was working in Ghana, born in 24, I think. 27. So he's going to be 100 in 3 years' time. And he taught me the link between the invention of the camera in Europe. There's those cameras going out to Africa. They sort of stay in Africa and they get passed down from one generation to another. So by 1930, maybe by 1940, James Barnard inherited a 19th century camera and started to, document that environment. And then with Charlie Phillips particularly, being born in Jamaica, maybe in the 60s, 50s, 60s, he likewise started documenting his environment growing up in Notting Hill. But they had techniques and styles. And again, I was obsessed with what camera did you shoot on? What film did you shoot on? What did you print your work on? And everything that goes with that. And there's so many techniques. From Charlie Phillips, there's a particular frame of camera that he shoots on where he shoots upside down in a very specific way. James Barner also shot on the very same camera. I believe it's a Mamiya C330 or one of those derivative of a twin lens Japanese camera. But the point is that you have to sort of seek that knowledge to get context of how images worked, where the improvements came from. And to a certain extent, even from James Barner, understanding that when he went out to do a commission, he would go out into the village with his 10.8 camera. He would shoot the local chief. There was no electricity, there's no running water, so he had to use matches to expose the negative that's been made back onto paper to then sell it on and then move on to the next village. So there's a whole history of photography that's never been spoken about. And I feel that context is really important. And particularly when you see this room and you think, the master, the apprentices, all in one room. I'd like to think in 600 years' time those links could be made, because in photography those links really do exist.
Yeah, and I think it's something that is often quite hidden.
Oh, of course.
Like your name and being connected to that as a kind of working practice.
Can I just jump in there?
Yeah, please do.
Like, every working photographer in London pretty much uses the same lab, picks up everything from the same places. We all know what everyone's doing, but we just keep that quiet because for our clients, you can't give anything away. It's all magic, isn't it? But there's the printers, there's the retouchers, there's the lighting teams, there's so much behind the business of photography.
I think how many hands go into the work is really interesting. And when we look at this work, we talked about how, you noticed immediately, like, that candle's moved, it's changed in size, the grapes have changed in size. And when I look back over some of the research, that is the case. They've altered, and there's going to be multiple hands in a studio, working on these pieces. And it's the same, I suppose, for photography.
Absolutely, and as I said, I'd print for Charlie as much as I would, because for photographers, because our volume is so high, curating our work's almost impossible. I don't know how long it took to make this painting, but they're stuck on this painting for a moment, maybe 2 or 3 at a time, but they're locked into quite narrow universes. Whereas with photographers, we've got so much work, we can't really make those decisions without the support of other photographers who recognize the photography in the work. Because to make the print, particularly if you're coming from negative, is about knowing what the negative saw and enhancing that experience. And some negatives are much more difficult than for me, so I'll give them to a better printer than I. I only print easy negatives. Difficult negatives I leave to other people, because it's not that easy. And interpretation is a beautiful thing.
And how does your work then take it the next step on from Charlie and James?
Honestly, I don't want to. I just want to be in the same lineage. Yeah. My years are 93 to infinity, and Charlie's 59. James Barner was, I think, 47, because everyone knows their first picture, the first time you got paid for a picture. And you run as long as you can until your eyesight, even if your eyesight goes, you still keep it going. James Barner still shoots on an iPad, unfortunately, but he still shoots. Yeah, it really does, yeah. And he was showing off the other day. He was like, "Oh, look at this." And he's got portraits of Naomi Campbell. I'm like, "Oh, okay. You're hanging out with Naomi, are you? That's great. Didn't call me then."
Well, I think, talking about Naomi Campbell, these people in this painting, we've talked about it being an imagined scene. Yes. They're not real musicians. They're not known musicians. They're an idea of a musician. You're shooting real people. Can you talk a bit about that relationship and what that is, and maybe show some examples of what you've got with you?
I think for me it's about iconography, i.e., and that's more in line with the sort of Christian elements in this place, where it's you are the icon, and maybe I might be corrected in this, but the idea of the icon, particularly in religious thing, is that it's a route to God. So in some cases, I'm trying to create these iconic images in a way that they may be hung on a wall and used as some kind of... And I say all this because it took me 20 years to gather all my Wu-Tang negatives. And at the point at which I'd gathered all the negatives and I've seen the vision, I went to Italy, I went to see an old master printer who lived off the Adriatic coast. He made me 10 Wu-Tang prints, of which I walked into the local church and hung them there, because you can get a local priest to bless it, which I had to do. So I kind of saw the religiousness in the image, and I sort of hung out with Orthodox Christians in a cemetery in Brookwood, another story. But the point was that I kind of see that as the point. Like, you want to create that iconic eye contact particularly, and somehow it surmises what they're about and what their brand is. And if you're the Method Man, I want this picture to look like a Method Man. Whereas if I was to conjure up, like, oh, I want you guys to look like rappers, I wouldn't know where to start. Because much of the artists I photograph, they come ready-made. Like, Biggie got out of bed as Biggie, like the hat, the glasses, the Coogee top, the Versace jacket, the champagne at 10 in the morning. That's his lifestyle choices. He's living this life. I can't even pretend to, oh, I'm sorry, could you hold that champagne? No. The portraits of old DB, as you'll see in the book, that's his bottle of Baileys that day. Yeah. He got wasted. Yeah. Grapes. Let's all bring it down to grapes.
Absolutely. But you're kind of creating a visual language for hip-hop. That's your genre of music that you're working with. And you do that through light. Essentially, yeah. And I think it'd be interesting to talk a bit about how you create that through photography, going back to that kind of chiaroscuro that we talked about.
This is it. For me, it comes down to the drama of hard light. shadow, light. And you can see it in the buildings when you see the monk on his knees praying to God, desperate for an answer, and there's like God ray on them. That's where the drama is, and I try and bring that. If I can light the subject, I want drama. I need hard shadow, hard light. And much in the way, like when I print, I also print with, I don't have many prints here, unfortunately, but that's the Wu-Tang as a group. But when I print quite hard. The contrast is hard, the blacks are black, and the highlights are there. And that's an important part for me. And I think even the films I use and the papers that I print on, as long as they have that hard contrast and they give me that deep sense of black, that deep sense of highlight, then I feel like I've got a really strong, powerful image. That said, if I'm shooting other things, I can be more subtle, more gradients, less contrast. Some of the paintings on this side of the building are pretty much almost photorealistic in a way. But I'm kind of trying to push beyond the photo. I have to push beyond literalism because I am, as photographers, you work in the literal plane, but for our work to become art, we have to find a way of pushing it beyond literal into some kind of drama. And the best tool we have is contrast. And I think we can use that to great effect if we know how to. Yeah. And especially for me personally, I'm working in black and white. Ooh, pick your black point, pick your nice grays, and where's the white point, and you control all of that while you print. And again, it brings it back to this painting, how it sits on the wall, how it sits in the real space is kind of the challenge for us. I think it's easy for us to create work on a back projected device like a mobile phone. We're in that universe. All our work is designed to be that way. But if the final resting place is on the wall, then we have to approach it with a sense of drama, with a sense of something in the image that makes it, dare I say, pop.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And it would be interesting to just think about some of the kind of tropes and visual language that's used in hip-hop photography. And when we're thinking about this work, these people are imagined musicians to talk about the importance of music, and they're wearing what is technically like kind of fancy dress. It's costume, it's historic costume from for the time. They're positioned. We talked about it being like this behind the scenes almost. This like it feels like it's not the concert, it's the rehearsal. It's like the thing that happens before we're not really allowed into this scene.
But it feels like documentary photography as well. Bar the grapes, it does feel like documentary photography. And for me, that's a certain part of what we do, is to document the scene, to not really intrude upon it. So there's aspects of trying to create the portrait where you create the icon, but there's also aspects of trying to document the scene. I'm thinking particularly of certainly some of the covers that influenced me was the Pete Rock and CL Smooth covers, where it was shot by a photographer called Daniel Hastings, who would cross-process the negatives. So he'll take these high-contrast films, like Kodak E100 or any Ektar, for instance, and cross-process it to make it from a transparency to a negative. The contrast and the colors go insane. And then you try and control that in the print. But that really made me think that this is the language of hip-hop. It's much harder, much more intense, and that's the sort of that's the way to frame this music, So, and very much where, on the one hand, if I can get the subject to stand in front of the camera and look into the lens, on my big cameras, I'll get them to do that. But on my smaller cameras, the 35mm cameras, it's pretty much a document. The subject they're not looking into the lens per se. They're not looking into the lens. They're not engaging with us as viewers. We are watching a scene as it emerges. And can we hear the music in there? I feel I can hear that flute. I think he's singing out of tune. There's something about the way he looks. And she doesn't. There's something not right there. But I can definitely hear the flute. And my point is that it documents the scene. I think that's another language in hip-hop, and particularly when it comes to drum and bass culture, or if I'm documenting people dancing in a club, I don't need you to look into the lens. I just need you to be in that moment, because that's when you're most amazing. It's a Saturday night. You're lit, literally.
What happens with so music is audio, and it's an audio oral tradition. Why do we celebrate it in this way? Why is that important?
We're so wired to this thing called music, isn't it? I mean, particularly now, it's a Friday night, we've come off work, you want to dance, don't you? We want to dance. Like, when's the last time you went out dancing? How good does that feel? We're hardwired to celebrate. It helps us. It's something hardwired. What I find really beautiful about hip hop, particularly now we're looking at 50 years, is that it's poetry and rhythm put together. So you get the language coming at you in one direction, but the rhythms are quite hard. So even if you don't understand a word they're saying, you're still bouncing to the beat. And that it's the most human thing I can imagine. And this is an art gallery about humanity and the human experience, and one of the most amazing things about that human experience. Now, obviously, these guys were Catholic, led.
Well, Utrecht is interesting because it's quite a kind of heavily dominated Catholic part of the Netherlands, but
Protestant world, yeah.
But there were a lot of Protestant kind of people operating, and they had the power.
This is it. And the thing that fascinates me is that obviously there's a certain era of painting is dominated by religious iconography, religious imagery, but there's that drift where this goes into secular. This isn't a religious narrative. There isn't Hebrew, and God isn't speaking to you directly. This is a human experience. And I feel like we've crossed that line where we don't have to have works that reflect our belief systems or come from that narrative, but and this feels like it's a break from that. It's the Caravaggio style, but not the Caravaggio subjects. And that, I feel, and then once we get into Rembrandt, we can all kind of see ourselves in the narrative again. Whereas I couldn't see myself in some of these scenes in here. I simply can't see myself I can't see it myself. Like this, I don't want to say the words. Yeah. It's hard. It's brutal.
Yeah, absolutely. But photography, I suppose, allows us to do something different in how we represent. And how do you manage to kind of capture that liveness? Because that's kind of what photography almost was designed for, but it's a challenge still.
It really is a challenge. I think over the years, I'm not as good at it as I was because it's timing. You want to represent the subjects as real as you can without them becoming a false representation of a situation, of a moment. And it's timing. There's a fraction of a second between that moment and when it's just slightly lost, where you want the aesthetic to be pure so it looks great from a distance, but you also want the narrative and the story inside it to be quite complete. You want 1,000 words, and 999 just won't do. That's when you've kind of locked it in. I feel when it comes to documentary work, street photography, certainly shooting in clubs, shooting where people are dancing and having a good time, I was better when I was younger. It's harder now. And even now, when I'm working with Charlie Phillips, we're going to set up a studio. Yeah, let's set up a studio, nice comfortable studio, lighting, backdrops, props, grapes. We're going to do that. Because to do it on the street like we did, I think that's a moment that you can do when you're young. And you should appreciate that energy when you're young, because you're up late, it's 4 a.m, you're out dancing, you're having a great time. Those are the moments that as a young person you want to remember, because it's life, isn't it? You're peaking. And so it does change, but I feel when you're in that moment and you're in with the groove, the music, the beat, the people, the whole experience, you're one, and you've got that camera, you're good. So you went to Glastonbury this year, how was that?
I did go to Glastonbury.
Did you take a camera?
I was very tired.
But there's those moments after midnight when it's dark, the sun's gone down, and everyone's in this energy. It's just right. Everyone's bouncing at the same beat, And the camera there, it
doesn't do it justice.
You tried. Yeah. You all tried, but when you do get it right, when the photographer, when the painter gets that moment right, and you kind of want it on your wall.
Well, that's what this is. This is trying to capture a feeling of music. Of what it is and how important it is, and like you say, the kind of human condition. And I feel like that's a really good point for us to kind of bring our conversation to an end and open it up to questions in the room. Is that okay? Can I get a round of applause for Eddie Otchere?
Thank you.